Hi, welcome to the Indie Wine Podcast, episode 42. My name is Matt Wood. Today we're looking at Christopher Buckley and his historic Ravenswood estate. Buckley was a blind political boss in San Francisco during the latter part of the 19th century. Ravenswood was his 100-plus acre country estate in the upcoming wine-producing region of the Livermore Valley. There have been books and articles written about Buckley, but they all tend to gloss over the vineyard and wine-producing side, giving just the basic information, sometimes misinformation, or conflicting stories. I've tried to piece it all together here from the original sources when possible to give an accurate depiction of his winemaking and his estate. Here we go. Christopher Augustine Buckley was born in New York City on Christmas Day, 1845, to Irish immigrant parents. His father was a stonemason and gold seeker. He traveled multiple times to California in an attempt to strike it rich in the gold fields. In 1862, he brought his family along for the adventure. They settled permanently in bustling San Francisco. Christopher was 17 at the time and secured a job as a conductor on the horse cars of the city. Picture one of San Francisco's famous cable cars, but drawn by a couple of horses instead of an underground cable. He saw the entire city going by at 6 miles per hour working for the Omnibus Railway Company, the iron tracks guiding the car through North Beach to South Beach, his usual route and through districts for both work and play. Riders were able to get out of the sand and mud and horse shit that plagued San Francisco at the time. Much of the horse shit was dumped on the sand dunes where Golden Gate Park now resides. Ridership boomed as businesses grew up along the rails. Buckley got to see and know the habits of his fellow San Franciscans from his conductor box. But he had other and some bigger ideas on his mind. The Snug Saloon was located at Montgomery and Washington Streets and was one of the finest in the city. It was just below McGuire's Opera House, one of the largest around. This was the first opera house built in the city to hold a grand opera. Some of the finest actors in the country performed there, including Edwin Booth. Mark Twain saw Mazeppa here and wrote a review for the San Francisco Call daily paper that became infamous. Quote, "The scenery and appointments are very well indeed, but the cast is miserably defective," unquote. Also nearby was the Monkey Block, or Montgomery Block. It was the tallest building west of the Mississippi when it was constructed in 1853. 4 stories. It became a meeting place for artists, authors, lawyers, politicians, and more over the years. Mark Twain, Jack London, Ambrose Bierce, Bret Hart, Lotta Crabtree, Joaquin Miller, and others would frequent the building. It was called, quote, "the classic old Montgomery Block building, the most famous literary and artistic structure in the West," unquote, by the poet Lawrence Ferlinghetti of City Lights later on. It was fire and earthquake resistant and the only building left standing in the area after the 1906 earthquake and fire. Today, it's the location of the Transamerica Pyramid Building. Now, all of this is to say that this location and Buckley's new profession as a bookkeeper and bartender and later a mixologist at the Snug Saloon give him access to an influential class of person. It helped fulfill a desire of his, quote, "It was the laudable ambition of aspiring youth to secure a portfolio as a mixologist in one of the great saloons, for the opportunity of meeting the great in their hours of relaxation and good humor," unquote. Writers, actors, lawyers, merchants, politicians, and everyone else would confide in young Buckley. Bill Higgins would too. He was a Republican boss and gave Buckley his first political lessons, making him, quote, "a handyman behind the ballot box," unquote. After a brief foray to start his own saloon, Buckley returned to the Snug as a partner with McGuire. Again, this only lasted a couple years until Buckley felt the pull of the rapidly growing town of Vallejo across the bay. This is where he really cut his teeth in politics, learning the ways, getting things done on his own, gaining that experience, and establishing contacts while running his exchange saloon. Back in San Francisco, he switched to the Democratic Party, rising through the ranks as he and his partners operated a variety of bars, saloons, boarding houses, and more. The Alhambra Saloon was opened by Buckley and another political man at Bush and Kearny Streets, just a few blocks down from the Monkey Block. It quickly became known informally as Buckley's City Hall. San Francisco was undergoing massive changes at the time. The population increased fivefold in 20 years. The diversity exploded as people settled there after failures in the goldfield, and more poured in from the east. Buckley regarded politics as a more or less private enterprise, meaning things could be bought and sold. Political parties could be started, stopped, manipulated. After its slaughter in the 1881 election, Buckley took over the Democratic Party organizing in the city. He broke the city up into 47 neighborhood districts and placed well-known men from the area, usually higher-profile merchants, in charge, and registrations came pouring in. Clubs acted as welfare organizations, employment centers. They helped with weddings and funerals. They also threw parties and sponsored picnics and music, ingraining themselves in the fabric of the neighborhoods. With Buckley as the power in the shadows, they nearly swept the 1882 election. His run would continue mostly unbroken for about a decade. This was a time of vote early, vote often politics, and votes could be manipulated in a variety of ways. The crews at French ships that were anchored in the bay voted. The dead voted. Men with fake beards voted. Men passing through the boarding houses voted. Votes changed tickets, got lost, and ballot boxes got stuffed. There's lots of things that could happen. During this run, Buckley lost his eyesight, going nearly completely blind. He was only able to distinguish light and dark. Critics would say it was from tainted alcohol and drunkenness. There's no evidence that this was true or that he ever served tainted alcohol in his establishments. Diabetes, glaucoma, or a neurological disorder are other theories. It didn't affect his political performance at all. He was reportedly able to recognize most by their footsteps, handshake, or voice. He lacked in formal education, but spoke with the best of them, quoting law and authors, always dressed smartly and confident in his manners and comfortable amongst all. Buckley was the blind boss of San Francisco. Alex Gregains, a former prizefighter, acted as his bodyguard, aide, and friend. Buckley was always a high-priced man and could get nearly anything accomplished for a fee. Contracts, political appointments, liquor licenses, even the sheriff's office, rail lines, and utilities. He ran it all from his cramped office at the Alhambra Saloon. Over time, as his success grew, his offices would too. Something more befitting of a man of his stature. He helped with getting his ally George Hearst elected to the U.S. Senate, but Hearst's son, William Randolph, who took over running the paper, deeply disliked Buckley, going back to a contract dispute in their youth. Buckley's downfall as the boss only started when he lost touch with the common man and their needs as he became more removed from the daily hustle and bustle of the city. Many would assert that Buckley didn't corrupt San Francisco politics. It had been done long before. The extra-legal committees of vigilance fighting against the Sydney Ducks and others, all the politicians that schooled Buckley on the ways of the city's politics and how to get things done. But Buckley seemed to have perfected it. He even helped balance the books of the city by getting back taxes collected from utilities. In March of 1895, his former right-hand man was openly hunting Buckley in the streets of San Francisco. Jake Rudolph, who it was said, quote, is handy with a gun, was a henchman and associate of Buckley's and was upset with Buckley withholding some stock shares. The month before, Rudolph had tried to kill M.H. DeYoung, the editor of the San Francisco Chronicle. Buckley sprung for Rudolph's lawyers to get those charges lowered, and after a few weeks at a Stockton asylum, Rudolph was free again. Buckley escaped to Livermore and hid out for a few weeks after alerting the police department. Gradually, Buckley started to spend more time at his Ravenswood estate in Livermore, drifting away from politics as he tried to regain his vision. He even traveled to London and Heidelberg for consultation on his eyesight. His wife Anne-Marie and son Chris always accompanying him to Ravenswood. Much was made of a comment that Buckley said, quote, I would give $100,000 to look for 1 minute at my boy." Unquote. All the treatments he tried were unsuccessful. They, like many of the other well-to-do families in San Francisco, had country estates in the East Bay. We've covered some of these already with Professor Hilgard and John Sweat, and there will be more in the future. Mr. Henderson, editor of the San Francisco Examiner paper, was just to the west of Buckley and Livermore. The railroad ran to Livermore, and their tally-hoes or carriages could be waiting at the station for them. It's about 45 miles away from San Francisco. Of course, in those days, you would have to catch a ferry to Oakland before hopping on the train. The Livermore Valley was rising to be among the most recognized wine regions in the state at the time. The 100 acres for Ravenswood were purchased from Joseph Black in 1885. Black had a 6,000-acre ranch that he was slowly subdividing up and selling off parcels of. Vines, almond and apple orchards, and flowers were planted on the gently rolling land. Olive trees lined the road leading to Buckley's home. By the 90s, Buckley and his wife and young son were spending most of their time in Livermore. Upon completion of the house on the property, the builder insisted on a christening. Thinking back to the most beautiful place Buckley had seen, it was named Ravenswood after a location on Long Island. Buckley built a cottage house on the property and then a larger house with only 3 rooms, mostly for entertaining visitors. A tank house, carriage house, stables, and winery were also built on the property. 60 acres of grapes were now bearing fruit in the gravel and red sandy loam soils. Its location in Livermore was chosen by Buckley because phylloxera hadn't yet arrived in the area, and he, quote, "sought this region for its rare climate and for a resting spot, but has fallen in with the spirit of its surroundings," unquote. He was one of the founding members of the Livermore Valley Wine and Grape Growers Association. Mostly French grapes, as was the style of the day, were planted with the help of Charles Wetmore of Cresta Blanca. Folie Blanche, Semillon, Morastel, French Colombard, Mataro, Muscat de Bordelais, Sauvignon Vert, Grand Noir, Carignan, Petit Syrah, Sauvignon Blanc, and then Zinfandel, of course, were all planted on the southwestern exposures of the vineyard. The planting was all supervised by Wetmore, with the idea of planting what grew well in Livermore and what they suspected had a resistance to phylloxera. Buckley's neighbor to the south, Henry Wagner, who also purchased his property from Black, didn't find as good of luck running a winery. After not crushing grapes in 1888, he sold it to Buckley in 1889, renting it back for a time. Wagner's winery was expected to handle 600 tons that season and had another 100,000 gallons of mostly oak cooperage. This purchase brought Buckley's vineyards up to 100 producing acres. By 1890, he was producing wine and shipping it to the local rail stop. As originally designed, the winery just south of his house would produce 75,000 gallons a year. It consisted of a basement plus 2 stories measuring 65 by 75 feet. The cooperage was about 3/4 oak and 1/4 redwood. Buckley's preferred wine was, quote, "To his friends he preferred a Morastel wine, full-bodied and dark, dispelling from the small glass holding it an aroma as deep as if it rose from a barrel," unquote. Buckley still had a political fight left, but this one he would lose. He, along with James Concannon and Carl Winty, would come out against the California Wine Association in the short-lived wine wars. They were part of the contingent from the Livermore Valley to meet with the CWA. Buckley came down on the side of the California Winemakers Corporation in their battle with the CWA. He was, quote, "an ardent supporter of the Winemakers Corporation. He is firm in the belief that the wine interests of this valley for the future are dependent upon the organized corporations. With them lies the salvation of every small producer in the land. Mr. Buckley is the first one to follow the suggestions of the Winemakers Corporation, but there will be others in the valley who follow his example," unquote. When pressed about Livermore and the wine business, Buckley said, quote, "The prospects are brightening, especially for the growers of Livermore Valley. Here we are freest from phylloxera. The vineyards of Napa and Sonoma are doomed. The reputation and the demand for California wines, especially Livermore Valley wines, is on the increase. With a diminishing supply and a growing market, there can be but one result. Those who stay with the business intelligently and faithfully are sure to win. If my advice was sought as to what vines to plant, I should say plant for quantity. There's absolutely no profit in the high-class wines. I have in my cellar the choicest of aged wines that have probably cost me $1 a gallon, for which jobbers are offering me 20 cents. If I must give it away, those people will never get any of it. Do you know those jobbers are the curse of the business? They're a worse nuisance than the phylloxera." Unquote. Buckley made this comment in December of 1895, right as the wine wars were kicking off, driving wine prices lower and lower as everyone fought for market share. Wine was shipped in bulk by rail car, 4 puncheons, tied down and holding thousands of gallons of wine, shipped off to get lost in million-gallon blends. We saw it a couple episodes ago with the Natoma vineyards also. We'll get to the root of the issue in some upcoming episodes. In this instance of 1895, it appears he sold his entire vintage of wines to the nearby Montrouge winery that was quickly making a name for itself. It was one of only 4 California wineries to win a gold medal at the 1900 Paris Exposition. Phylloxera was in fact found at Ravenswood and other vineyards in the Livermore Valley this year. The plan was to exterminate it with the bisulfide of carbon solution that was popular. John Wheeler, who we met in the Natoma episode, in fact sold the solution at the same time he was on the Viticultural Commission promoting it as a cure. It was usually injected into the soil at the base of the vine. It would kill the vine too. It wasn't really an economically viable solution. The growers in the area pooled some money to treat any vineyards that had evidence of phylloxera. Wetmore also imported 245,000 Riparia cuttings packed in sawdust from Nebraska. These were promptly distributed to many of the prominent growers in the valley. Wetmore had more cuttings on the way also. Perhaps because of some replanting, Theodore Geyer, the Oakland and Livermore-based wine dealer, would lease cellar space from Buckley for 3 years during this time. Geyer was using his own winery he had purchased from Charles Wetmore to process the grapes of the 60-acre Dos Mesas vineyard. They would get about 83 tons of Cabernet, Cab Franc, Petit Verdot, Petit Syrah, Sauvignon Blanc, Semillon, Mataro, Petit Pinot, Petit Bouschet, Zinfandel, and Muscat. The finished wines would be stored in Buckley's Ravenswood cellars. Geyer himself was planting 30 acres that year and Buckley 10 amongst a spree of planting on resistant rootstocks valley-wide. As always when I'm discussing these grapes, I'm using what's in the literature at the time, so some of the names might be slight synonyms for what we know today, or pronounced slightly differently. The California Winemakers Corporation pushed Buckley to expand, and in 1897, the winery cooperage was boosted to 350,000 gallons. The original winery was mostly made of redwood, and new 18-inch thick concrete walls in the remodeled winery would help it stay insulated from temperature swings. It was now 86 feet by 120 feet. 40 new fermenters as well as a new crusher and press were installed. The winery was capable of processing 60 tons a day. Westinghouse Junior engines would drive all the pumps and machinery. Another success of the vintage was Buckley, along with the help of Messrs. Wente, Concannon, Paris, and Wagner, that Livermore would receive $7 per ton from the Winemakers Corporation instead of the usual $5. That was more than everyone but Sonoma and Napa counties would receive that year. A distillery was added this year too. Buckley would produce and sell cognac made from his Follet Blanche grapes. With the harvest of 1897, the papers took pleasure in his new calling. Quote, "The grape crop of Livermore Valley is now being harvested, and the growers report a larger and finer crop than was ever raised in that territory. A great deal of this success is due to the perseverance and active work of San Francisco's old-time blind politician Chris Buckley. The same attention to detail, force of character, indomitable pluck, and ceaseless application that characterized Buckley in the palmy day of his political reign have during the past 5 years have been directed toward the improvement of Livermore Valley." Buckley is quoted as well, quote, I have, I think, thoroughly mastered much of the difficulty in grape growing in this valley. I've gone deeply into all details of soils and vines and scales and have been able to bring about some changes that have materially advanced the quality of the grapes and of the wine. I have worked with the vineyardists all around me and think we have been of mutual benefit to each other. I have long thought that wine growing could only be made profitable by organization, and this last summer, we have succeeded in perfecting an organization among our growers that has guaranteed to them the best prices they could hope to receive. I think now that all growers in the valley are of one mind and see that their only safeguard consists in working together." Unquote. Ravenswood was a busy winery this year, producing over 150,000 gallons with a crew of 14 men working there. Some of their new cooperage was running behind and still needed to be constructed. Aside from 100 acres that were bearing fruit, he also processed grapes for another 8 vineyards this season. Livermore Valley produced more wine than ever this vintage, 2.1 million gallons. C.J. Wetmore, Charles' brother, had this to say, quote, "The grape growers and winemakers have made money this year and will continue to do so, for Livermore wines are sold all over the world and are recognized as the best wines made in California. It has been a hard struggle, but we have won at last." Unquote. The 1898 vintage was sold to F. Chevalier & Co., who started in the liquor business in Sacramento and Placerville during the gold rush. They transitioned into wine over time, eventually starting Chateau Chevalier in St. Helena, now owned by Spring Mountain Vineyard. Buckley received 13.5 cents per gallon for red and 17 cents per gallon for his white wines. It's noted that this was the best price that had been paid so far for that year's production. Growers who had their wines made at Ravenswood were expected to see $12 to $16 per ton for their grapes. With time, he became known as the Lord of Livermore. From about 1903 to 1917, Wetmore Bowen, makers of Cresta Blanca wines, would run the winery, mostly blending the Ravenswood wines into the award-winning Cresta Blanca souvenir wines, or their sparkling Burgundy and sparkling Sauterne. The distillery was turned into a bottle washing plant. They even electrified the winery in 1903. Despite archaeological digs at the site, no Ravenswood labels have ever been found. Many Livermore wineries acted as bulk shippers at this time, the nearby Pioneer Winery being a good example of a CWA member winery. The winery was now holding 350,000 gallons. I've seen articles mention it got up to be 500,000 gallons, but have never seen a reliable source for that number. The Raboli family lived nearby, and the families would often dine together. The Rabolis had wineries and vineyards as well in Livermore. By 1918, when Buckley gave up on the wine trade, his grapes were sent to the Raboli winery located on 2nd Street in Livermore. During Prohibition, the winery was used as storage for the Concannon family. They were still making wines, altar wines for the church, until a fire destroyed the winery in the late 1920s. The vineyard was leased to the Concannon family and then torn out in the 1940s due to poor health. Even while living at Ravenswood, Buckley still had a grand San Francisco home as well as other real estate investments in the city. During the 1906 earthquake and fire, his San Francisco real estate was all uninsured and destroyed. Christopher Buckley passed away in San Francisco in 1922. His estate worth over $1 million. He was honored by the papers that had denigrated him and his political maneuvers. Buckley left a complicated legacy. To the Chinese, he was known as the Blind White Devil. William Randolph Hearst called him an unconvicted felon. He was tried in the court of law multiple times, but never convicted. He did know lots of people after all. I don't think he was a Boss Tweed type bleeding the city dry, but he did manipulate and stretch the laws and rules to fit his needs. Funny enough, the district in New York he was born in was a breeding ground for Tammany Hall men. At times he was benevolent and made donations to charity or helped out families. And other times he wasn't, focusing on getting his men elected through all the means at his disposal. As he backed away from politics, his image seemed to rehabilitate itself on its own. At the Concannon family's urging, Christopher Jr., after his father's death, sold the Ravenswood estate to the Redemptionist Fathers for use as a retreat. They renamed it Villa San Clemente. It was used as overflow housing for their West Coast chapter, which was based in Oakland. Part of it was turned into a Christmas tree farm. Although in the 1970s the estate was sold to a developer, 33 acres were set aside. You can still visit it today. In 1985, Winty put in 7 acres of head-trained Sauvignon Blanc, caring for it each year. Unfortunately, by 2001, most of the vineyard had died off and the vines were torn out again. In 2006, 12 acres were replanted. The northern section has Zinfandel, Mataro, and Grenache planted in a head-trained style. The southern portion contains Zinfandel, Malbec, Petit Verdot, Cabernet Franc, and Petit Syrah on a trellis system running southwest to northeast to mitigate some of the direct sun. The vineyard has appeared as Corvina Bosco, meaning Ravenswood in Italian. All that remains of the winery are 3 concrete walls of uncertain soundness. They really look like they could fall down at any moment. It seems like at one point in the 80s, the winery was going to be restored and used as a museum of Livermore Valley winemaking. They would even have overnight field trips with the schools, cooking period food and having the children prune vines or harvest grapes depending on the time of year. To my knowledge, it never went anywhere. The entire estate is on the National Registry of Historic Places. I have a little bit of bonus content that I didn't want to include and sidetrack the main story, but I thought it was interesting, even if not as wine-related. Buckley had a donkey named Ephraim, who was said to be their boxing donkey. He was, quote, trained in the art of prize fighting, unquote. Buckley's bodyguard and friend Alex Gragans, who we met earlier, was said to have coached him up. Gragans was a heavyweight fighter. Ephraim was said to be, quote, the sensation of the Livermore Valley, unquote. Aside from prize fighting, Ephraim would also give the children rides at birthday parties. So there you go. I also need to talk about the tally-ho. I'm totally unfamiliar with this term. This was a type of carriage that was popular at the time, apparently. I tried to find more info about them, but there isn't much to be found, although every type of carriage has its own name, and there are a lot of types. There was a coach called the tally-ho, built by Holland and Holland, but it became shorthand for any 4-in-hand coach, one person driving 4 horses at once. It's probably what you're thinking of when you think of what rich Gilded Age men would drive. This was, of course, the way Buckley and others would get from the train station to their homes. Another story was that Buckley might have had his own guests held up on the Ravenswood Road out to his house when they were arriving for dinner. The guests were judges and politicians and their wives. Joining them from Livermore were some fellow gentlemen growers. Buckley was going to taste them on some of his Morastel. Quote, it was a Morastel accented not on the similarity with the French Morastel, but on the differences, unquote. Accounts vary. Account number 1. A man masked and with a shotgun stepped out from behind the bend into the already dark Ravenswood Road just past Dr. Robertson's sanitarium. Shotgun raised, he had all guests on the tally-ho empty their pockets into a bag he flung in front of them. Buckley's guests got down from the carriage, emptying their valuables into the bag. The highwayman told them not to go on for another 10 minutes. After arriving at Ravenswood, authorities were notified. Police and sheriffs roamed the countryside all night searching. They never found anyone, though. It was shortly before election time, and the news would of course make all the papers. Account number 2. Buckley's carriage was carrying the group, who hit a man in the dark who was most likely drunk and who fired a couple revolver shots, not hitting anything. You can decide what you think is true. Could be treacherous driving your carriage out there. There are articles of Buckley's carriage being run into while going around a corner, killing one of his prized horses, and also of highwaymen holding up coaches on these lonesome country roads at night. Last item. Buckley also had a poem written about him and his grift. There are some political illustrations that are basically a visual version of this poem. Made a slight edit here for some language, but here it is. The Buckley Man. The Bogey Man. Come all of you little Democrats and listen unto me. I'll tell you of a Buckley man who is now across the sea. He was the shrewdest little man, though he could hardly see. For many a year he boodled. Hear the great democracy. Hush, 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 here comes a Buckley man. You'd best look out, for there's no doubt he'll catch you if he can. Look out, you little Democrats, here comes a Buckley man. He wore a dandy suit of clothes, likewise a diamond pin. And if you wish to see the boss, a fellow let you in. He owned a country mansion, and he drove a spanking pair, and he put on all the airs and style of a boodle millionaire. Thanks for listening today. I've always thought the Buckley story was intriguing from a couple different angles. Obviously, the blind political boss of the Gilded Age making wine is something you don't find every day. I find it interesting also that he was essentially a bulk shipper. His was the type of winery that there were so many of at the time in this growing California wine industry. They're selling their wines to whoever paid the most. In many ways, they were sort of the foundation of the industry when bulk wines were set by region. Many of these regions also had their own strong-willed men in charge. Sometimes this era is thought of as only peasant farmers and little old country wineries, but vineyardists wanted to be up on technology and innovation as much as everyone else. They wanted to make a buck, too. Buckley's Ravenswood winery existed in a really interesting time also. Right as a massive wave of consolidation was hitting the wine industry on the run-up to Prohibition. We're going to be looking at some more stories from the time soon. You can follow the podcast on wherever you're listening and the Instagram at Indie Wine Podcast. And feel free to email indiewinepodcast@gmail.com with comments, questions, or feedback. If you can tell your wine friends about the podcast too and help spread the word, I'd really appreciate it. Rating or subscribing helps too. There's also a Patreon if you choose to support the podcast monetarily to allow for more episodes and to help defray other costs. Any amount helps. I have a small token of my appreciation to send to you also if you do. The link for that's in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode. Have a good one.